All right, so this video is going to cover the first three chapters or sections of Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. The different kinds of philosophy, the origin of ideas, and the association of ideas. And strangely enough, the longest of those sections or chapters is going to be the one I spend the least amount of time on. Not because there's nothing important in there. And by the way, that's the first one, the different kinds of philosophy. But because there, Hume is more, it's very much an introductory chapter. It's letting you know what kind of stuff he's going to be up to, and it's going to provide a brief defense of his getting up to it. There are some very important things in there, things that we'll come back to a bit when we're done with this book. But not going to spend too much time talking about it. The only 2 points I want to bring out are one, what the two kinds of philosophy are. So the two kinds of philosophy are what he sometimes calls the philosophy of the moralists and the philosophy of the metaphysicians. The philosophy of the moralists he characterizes as people who focus on human beings as agents, as active beings. And their main concern is to basically laud virtue, to paint a picture of human nature that will encourage people to behave the right way. He thinks it's very closely related to common sense. He thinks it's typically imprecise and very clearly lacking in a kind of rigor. That said, he thinks it's very important. We're going to see Hume return again and again to this idea of the importance of focusing on the practical aspects of things. But the other one is metaphysicians, people who are going to move much more slowly, be much less tied to common sense, be far more focused on coming up with an accurate description and understanding of what they investigate. The metaphysicians. And he talks about the sort of conflict between these two groups. The main thing to take away here is the fact that the metaphysicians are engaged in an abstract and the moralists are engaged in a practical inquiry. Now, this book is very much going to be of the abstract kind of philosophy. That said, there will be key points where Hume is going to seem to avert to the practical interest or basic practical facts about the world in order to settle major issues in this book. So just be aware of that distinction. Philosophy done with a practical aim and philosophy done with what he characterizes as an abstract interest. I will point out, by the way, that Hume's prediction about what kind of philosophy leads to longer lasting fame is entirely wrong. So he thinks that Cicero will be more famous and more widely talked about than Aristotle. And he talks about two figures I honestly have to confess I don't know anything about as being more famous than Malebranche and Locke, who are two figures who get read in every history of almost every history of modern philosophy course. And the other two, Addison and Le Breur, I don't know who they are. Or rather, I've never read them. But that's the one thing. The other thing is how Hume characterizes the kind of metaphysical investigation he's going to engage in, because it's an odd thing to call metaphysics. What is clear if you read this first chapter is that if you were to use a contemporary term to describe the kind of investigation Hume is involved in here, it's psychology. Hume is primarily remembered as a philosopher. It is in philosophy classes and philosophy departments you're most likely to come across Hume. But Hume was active across a wide range of disciplines that are distinct now. So Hume was probably most famous in his own time for his works on history. He has contributed in lasting ways to the discipline of economics. He was good friends with Adam Smith, and he contributed certain quite important essays in the early history of Scottish and British economics. He is very important in the history of psychology. And the thing to realize is, if you complete this, just putting philosophy in there, we're still in a time when we're talking about Hume where these things aren't distinguished between very much. If you had a chair in moral philosophy, which, for example, his friend Adam Smith did at I believe, the University of Edinburgh, you were expected to teach all those things. And in fact, people like Adam Smith did. And Hume kept trying his whole life to get a job like that. There was no sharp division between these disciplines yet. In the way that physics had already kind of separated itself out from philosophy. Like once Newton really got going, people just started doing the same kind of thing Newton was doing, and more ignoring some of the older philosophical disputes. Right? Once you get what you take to be a firm foundation that can provide a basis for future investigations, taking that basis as just assumed, in this case, taking Newton's approach to natural philosophy as a given, you can sort of ignore some of the more abstract stuff that goes on. Right? You can ignore some of the puzzles that philosophers tend to focus on. But that hadn't happened for these disciplines yet. And so it bears keeping in mind here that at least part of what Hume wants to do is just get an accurate picture of the human mind. To the extent that he's going to talk about topics that are squarely at the center of philosophical inquiry and have been at the center of philosophical inquiry throughout history, he's doing so with an eye not so much of engaging with those issues directly, but with an eye towards talking about how we think about those issues. So he's going to be talking about things like the nature of causation. He's going to be talking about inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. He's going to be talking about freedom of the will. He's not going to use that term to describe it. He's going to be talking about the nature of knowledge. He's going to be talking about all these things. But he's approaching it from the direction of figuring out, all right, how does our mind work when it comes to these things? The way he would put it is, where do our ideas about things like knowledge, causation, freedom of the will, induction and deduction, where do they come from? How do we get those ideas? And what kinds of inferences do we normally make about them? To a significant extent, not an exclusive extent, but to a significant extent, this is a descriptive task. It is a bit closer to what we would nowadays think of psychology than something like what Descartes was certainly up to, or Plato, and also to a degree Aristotle were up to, where all of them were investigating these issues sort of directly. Hume is really investigating, well, what do we think, right, about these things? How does our mind work about these things? So he's looking at human beings first and foremost. You might think, well, isn't that kind of what the others were up to as well? Like Descartes had as the foundation of all knowledge, knowledge of the self. There's a difference there, though. Descartes is involved in a project to justify all sorts of things that we think, to justify belief in God, to justify belief in free will, to justify belief in the outside world. And Hume is a little more interested in just, well, where do we get those ideas? What actually are the content of those ideas? Rather than immediately a matter of justifying or not just declaring a belief justified or not justified. And we'll see that the contrast between those two approaches is actually related to the contrast between the practical and the abstract, which will come up again throughout the book. All right, so that's all I'm going to say for now about section 1, and I'm going to deal with sections 2 and 3 sort of together. All right, that brings us to chapters or sections 2 and 3, the origin of ideas and the association of ideas. And in it, Hume is going to lay out what's effectively a psychological theory. And instead of drawing this up on the blackboard, I've got this little sheet that I'll post online so you can have access to it, that I think hopefully makes it clear. So here's what Hume thinks here's how Hume thinks our mind works. And his primary argument for all of this is just introspection. He thinks if you pay close attention to what goes on in your own mind, you'll realize that what he says about the mind is true. He has a few other arguments about it, and I'll get to those when the time comes. But first off, the broadest category of sort of items in your mind are what he calls perceptions. Now, that can be a little confusing because it's very common to use the word perception to talk about what Hume is going to call just sensation. Information coming into your mind from the outside. That is not what he means by perceptions. Perception is like anything you're aware of in your own mind. You can think of it as all the things that you can perceive being in your own mind. Those are the perceptions. And perceptions are broken down into two groups, impressions and ideas. And the primary difference between impressions and ideas, according to Hume, is that impressions are more vivid than ideas. So he asks you to think about what it feels like, and I'll use a different example. Imagine what it feels like the first time you ever tasted what is now your favorite food, right? Try to think back to that. You have a memory of that moment. Do you really think you're feeling as strongly when you sort of think about that memory as you did when you actually tasted the food the first time? Right? You can maybe remember a little bit of what the flavor was, but can you really remember what it tasted like in its full complexity and vividness? No, you lose things with memory, right? Memory is a copy of a previously held experience or an experience you had before. And memories are less vivid than the experiences that they're memories of. You lose things over time, right? You don't copy everything completely. This is just why it's better to actually experience things than to just remember them or think about them. But that suggests falsely, right? That example, that impressions are just sensations. They're just experiences of the outside world. That would be to say that impressions are just, like I have here, sensations. But I've got another category here under impressions, and that's passions. What we would now call emotions. So Hume thinks emotions are impressions just as much as sensations are. It's just that the passions or the emotions come from, in a sense, within you. They might be responses to what happened out in the world, but you're not, and hopefully none of us ever think that when we feel sadness, we're perceiving sadness outside of us, right? That there's something there, like sadness is one of the things out there in the external world, and when we feel sadness, that's us detecting it in the outside world. That's not what's going on. We all know it's not what's going on. The sadness is within us. So it's not just sensations. It's not just our sensory organs taking in information from the outside that constitutes impressions. It's also passions, which come from within. And these things are, Hume thinks, the most vivid perceptions, mental items that you have. Sensations and passions or emotions. In addition to impressions, though, there are ideas. Ideas are copies of impressions, Hume thinks. We get impressions, and our mind has this natural tendency to copy those impressions. And what the result of the copying are ideas. Right? So memory is the easiest case to understand. You remember things that happened to you. You remember things you experienced. You remember things you felt. Right? And like Hume says, the memory is always less vivid than the original thing. But it is a record. It's a copy of the impression. Now, there are two other categories of ideas, or sources for ideas, rather. And that's imagination and reason. And I'll get to those actually in a bit when we go through the mental functions, which I have a little box here for mental functions. So we have Hume's psychological theory. You have perceptions as the broadest category. Impressions and ideas are the two subcategories of perceptions. Contained within impressions are sensations and passions. Contained within ideas are all the things that come from memory, imagination, and reason. You can call this second level, right, the level beneath impressions as ideas, the mental faculties. And he mentions them actually. In fact, he mentions all of them except sensation, strangely, in chapter 1 when he says, like, no one can doubt that the mind has parts. Here he's disagreeing with Plato, although Plato would have just thought that, like, reason is our soul. But put that aside. He says nobody can doubt that the mind has parts. What are those parts? He mentions the passions, memory, imagination, imagination, understanding, and the will. He doesn't mention sensations. He actually doesn't mention memory with the other 4, but he doesn't mention it. Strangely enough, the will's not here. That's because the will produces actions rather than perceptions. So that's why he's not covering it here. He'll get to the will later on. So let's talk about perceptions in general again. So perceptions can be, as I say here on the left, simple or complex. You can have simple sensations or complex sensations. You can have simple passions or complex passions. And here is what he means by that. Right? You can have, like right now, I am looking at my bookshelf, and what I'm getting is a complex impression. Right? You are looking at your screen, unless you've started doing something else on your computer and you're just listening to me, which is fine. Right. I'll post this thing so you can look at it. But right now, what I'm looking at is a bunch of books on a bookshelf. Here, I'll show it to you. This is my bookshelf. It's just one of many bookshelves I have because I have many leather-bound books. And I'm having a complex sensation. It's complex because I can break it down into parts. I can break it down by books. Like I can have this sensation of my bookshelf and I can pick some books from it. Right? Just think about those particular books as apart from all the rest of them. Meaning I can sort of break the experience down, break the sensation down, and just select out some parts of it. And the fact that I can break it down into parts that make sense means that it's complex. So a complex sensation is a sensation that has simple sensations as its parts. You almost never get simple sensations directly. You could presumably be in a situation where you're only having a sensation of one thing. Like imagine you're in some kind of sensory deprivation tank and then they let you have like just one note, right? There you'd be getting a simple sensation because it's like the only information coming in. But that's comparatively rare. Usually you're getting a lot of sensations all at once. You're getting visual sensations. The visual sensations themselves are complex. You're getting auditory sensations, again, complex. You're hearing a bunch of different things happening at once. You're smelling a bunch of different things. You're potentially even tasting a bunch of things at once. You're feeling a bunch of things at once. And you can break these sensations down into their parts. Similarly, you can have passions that are complex, right? If you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, right? The way they portray emotional maturation is that you start out having these completely distinct emotional reactions to things. And you're all one thing or another. You're either entirely afraid, entirely angry, entirely joyful, or entirely sad, right, in that movie. And that part of emotional maturation in that movie is coming to have these experiences that are in some sense blended, where you're feeling a little bit happy and a little bit sad, a little bit scared and a little bit grossed out, right? Those kind of things. That's not the most profound point in the world, but it is a good point, right? When you have emotional reactions to things, they're normally pretty complex. You're feeling a bunch of things at once. Okay. So impressions can come in simple or complex varieties. Similarly, then, because ideas are in their origin copies of impressions, you can have simple or complex ideas. If I have a complex perception of my bookshelf, complex visual perception of my bookshelf, then the idea that gets copied from that perception will, too, have parts. If I remember my emotional reaction to something, that memory is an idea. That memory will have a bunch of different emotional parts to it. you can have, now here's the way this becomes important. The fact that you can have simple or complex perceptions is going to help explain for Hume why it is that we can imagine some things that we've never perceived, right? So imagination is the source of some of the ideas that you have. And it seems like there's a problem for Hume because Hume says in these two chapters that the only way to get ideas is ultimately from impressions. All your ideas that you have in your mind are ultimately traced back to impressions, if they mean anything at all. Right? He seems to think that there might be this category of things in your head, which it's not clear where they'd fit in this taxonomy, but he seems to think there are certain words that don't refer to anything. You use them, but they're meaningless. And they're meaningless because they don't refer to any genuine ideas, and they don't refer to any genuine ideas because there's no corresponding impressions to go along with the ideas. Hume says all the genuine ideas you have in your head are originally copies of impressions. So impressions are the source of all your perceptions. Your mind has this fundamental function where it can copy, and that's where all the ideas come from, ultimately. Now, you might think, okay, well, if all my ideas come from impressions, well, I've got the idea of a centaur. I've never had an impression of a centaur. And what Hume is going to say is, well, here's what happened. You got various complex sensations over time. You got the complex sensation of watching a horse run through a field, and you got a complex sensation of a person walking through a field. And here's something your mind can do. It can take complex sensations, complex perceptions of any kind, and break them down. That's called analysis. The breaking of complex perceptions down into their component simple perceptions. So what you do is you take the horse part of the sensation of the horse running through the field out of the field. You just consider the horse by itself. And then you realize the horse itself is a complex sensation. You can break the horse down into part. The horse has got legs. The horse has got a head. The horse has a neck. The horse has a tail. And here's one of the things you can do. You can break it down into its component parts. And then one of the things you can do with that is just stop thinking of the horse head. And now you've just got a horse body with no head. And now you take the complex idea of a human being walking through a field, you pull the human being out of it, right? Because that's analysis, it's breaking the idea down. And you take the idea of a human being, you realize it too has parts. You break it down into its parts. It's got arms, legs, a trunk, right? A head. Take the legs off. Right? Now, take these two ideas, the idea of the headless horse and the idea of the legless human being, push them together. That's called synthesis. You can take simple perceptions and then put them back together into complex perceptions. But importantly, you can combine them into forms that you never had an impression of. So what happens to get a centaur, or his example is a golden mountain, is you have gotten complex sensations. They have been copied to become complex ideas. And then your mind does analysis and synthesis. And you can get weird combinations of ideas to get things that you never had an impression of because they've never existed. So what seems like it could be a problem for him really isn't. Right? By saying that the mind has, in addition to the copying function, the analysis and synthesis function, he can make sense of how we can have ideas of things we never had a perception of. He applies this to God. And he ends up saying the exact opposite thing from Descartes. Descartes thinks we start out with the idea of the infinite and we get the idea of the finite by restricting it. But Hume thinks, no, that's not what happens. What happens is we start with the idea of the finite and then we just remove the restrictions. That's how we get the idea of God. So we've got these perceptions. We've also got certain functions that the mind can do, certain actions the mind can take on those perceptions. We've got copying, synthesis, and analysis. We've also got association, which is how we move from one idea to another. Impressions we don't have control over, Hume thinks. Right? We can't make ourselves go from one sensation to another. What we sense is dependent on what's going on outside us. He also seems to think that's true of the passions. We don't have control of the passions, right? You can't just make yourself feel better. If you're angry, you can't just make yourself calm like that. It's not under your control. But ideas, there are certain rules that govern how we move from one idea to another. And he says there's basically three things that can take you from one idea to another. You can go from one idea to another idea that resemble each other, right? So let's say you're thinking about a horse, because I just had you thinking about a horse by describing a horse. Well, horses kind of resemble cows, so it would make sense if you moved from the idea of a horse to a cow. And then from a cow, you might say, well, a cow's kind of like a dog, so now you've gone to a dog. A dog is kind of like a cat, now you've gone to a cat. A cat is kind of like a rat, right? And so on and so forth. You can move from idea to idea by the resemblance of those ideas to each other. Another principle of association is contiguity. So that if you have an idea and you know that there is some other idea that's contiguous with it in space or time, you can move to it. So let's say you're thinking of the president, right? And most of your memories of President Trump involve him standing next to Melania Trump, the first lady. Well, even if they don't resemble each other that much, which they don't, your mind can move from Donald Trump to Melania Trump because they are nearby in a lot of your memories in space and time. Another, and this is going to be the really important one, association between ideas is cause and effect. He's going to have a lot to say about cause and effect. But for now, we can just say is when you have the idea of something, you naturally move to the idea of what caused that something or what that something does. It's the effects it has. And so we can, through reasoning, move from idea to idea. Another way we can do that, another thing we can do to move from idea to idea is, he thinks, deduction. We're familiar with deduction from Aristotle. This is one of the legitimate mental functions, is deriving ideas from other ideas. Really, it might just be a kind of analysis, right? So if you think about what deduction involves, like I said, it always involves the conclusion of a deductive argument, always involves less information than the premises. In a sense, that means you're kind of analyzing. You're pulling something out of a complex idea, and you're getting a comparatively more simple idea. You're taking a larger body of information and reducing and pulling out of it some smaller body of information. So it might be that deduction belongs under analysis. That's fine. Just realize that deduction is for Hume totally okay, right? It's one of those mental functions that is totally cool. He's down with it. It's totally natural. The reason I point this out is he's going to get to the point where he's saying some things about induction that are going to involve you realizing that he is totally cool with deduction. Now, reason is one of those mental faculties, and it can help produce ideas through the various mental functions. And reasoning gives us two things. It gives us what he calls relations of ideas and matters of fact. Basically, these are propositions. Reasoning can yield two kinds of propositions: relations of ideas or matters of fact, or as I've defined them, analytic claims and non-analytic or synthetic claims. I think I'll change that before I post it. Synthetic claims. Now, at this point, I've gotten everything in those two chapters, but I want to point something out here. Almost all the work that leads to some of the frankly bizarre conclusions that Hume is going to get to in this book has been done in these two chapters, which are frankly kind of boring, where he's just listing things that he says are in your head. But he's already basically just asserted that empiricism is true, right? If all your ideas ultimately come from impressions through some combination of copying, analysis, synthesis, association, or deduction, then you can't have any ideas that don't have their source in experience. So not only do you not have knowledge that isn't based in experience, you don't even have ideas that aren't based in experience. So that's one big thing. Another big thing is this list is supposed to be complete. So every other thing that the mind is said to be able to do, Hume's going to say, we better be able to understand the mind doing it in terms of this stuff, right? In terms of these perceptions or mental functions. And if it's not one of those, then it's nothing. Right? This is what the mind can do. Everything else we think the mind can do ought to be explicable in terms of these things. And what he's going to end up concluding is that there's a whole lot of things that we think the mind can do normally that it just can't. Right? Because these sets of perceptions and these sets of mental functions won't allow it. All right, before we finish up with Hume, or with these two chapters, I'm going to point out what I think is a very lovely little move by Hume. So Hume's made all these bold pronouncements about the nature of human psychology, in the process of which he's basically just asserted that empiricism is true. And notice that no real argument is given. The only argument that he gives is, well, when you introspect, you'll realize that I'm right. You can imagine bringing that to Plato or Descartes and just saying, well, look, you realize there's no ideas except for the ones based on sensations and, the look they give you. The other argument is that people who lack some ability to sense or feel, they lack some sensory modality or they lack some ability to feel certain kinds of emotions, can't ever get those ideas corresponding to those things. So he says, like, if you're deaf, you can't ever get the idea of a sound. If you are naturally kind and just don't feel angry, you're never going to get the idea. You're not going to understand what angry people are like. So if you were to accept that all impressions are sensations or passions, then it seems like if you lack the ability to get some kind of impression, you can't get the corresponding idea. But that only works as an argument if the only way to get ideas were those two ways, which is, of course, the exact thing he's arguing for. Like, imagine somebody who's a rationalist hearing Hume say this, right? And the person can just say, well, okay, yeah, I grant you that. If you've never heard a sound before, you're not going to have an idea of a sound. But the thing that a rationalist would be tempted to say that you have an idea of, right, that isn't based on experience, is something like, well, for Plato, the forms, or for Descartes, something like God. And those aren't things you would get from sensations or passions in the first place. So you would need an example that can touch those things, right? Because here's what Descartes or Plato would say. Yeah, you're not going to be able to get ideas of physical things or of internal emotional things unless you can feel those things. Those are ideas about feelings. So of course you need to be able to feel those things or sense those things. But not everything is an idea of those. That's the whole thing we're saying, right? That you can have ideas that go beyond those things. So as arguments go, introspection is not a very strong one, because if you're a rationalist, you're just going to say, I can introspect ideas that aren't based in experience. The other one just doesn't really provide any reason for a rationalist at all. And Hume does have a way of just kind of asserting big things and never arguing for them. And then, strangely enough, he's given credit by philosophers for arguing for them. The number of times you come across people saying Hume proved X, where when you go to the text, you realize, no, Hume just said X, and he said it with confidence. Here's a lesson. You can always make people think that you've made a good argument by just saying things confidently. This happens a lot, but something I really appreciate about Hume is he has this claim that all ideas come ultimately from impressions. And then he immediately brings up a counterexample to his own claim. And the counterexample has to do with the missing shade of blue. So I have here, down here, we can have imagined complex perceptions, because imagination is fundamentally a matter of analysis and then synthesis. But then there's this question, can we have imagined simple perceptions? Seems like no on Hume's model, right? Because imagination is going to allow you to think of things you've never experienced. He can deal with that fine if all imaginative perceptions or ideas are complex, because you just got them by rearranging simple perceptions that you got from sensation or the passions. No problem for Hume there. But what if you could imagine a simple idea? then it seems like that means that you can get ideas without basing them on impressions, right? The way to think about it is this: the only way you should be able to get simple ideas, according to Hume, would be by copying some complex impression, um, uh, or presumably it's possible to just copy a simple impression, like what I said with like a really simple emotion or a simple sensory situation, but mostly complex. So you can copy some complex impression, you can break it down by analysis and recombine it. But that doesn't allow the results of imagination to be simple. If you can come up with ideas that are simple, then it seems like that's going to be a counterexample to Hume. And he actually says he thinks there might be such a case. It's called the missing shade of blue. So I have here an image that I found on the internet. I found it all over the internet, and I couldn't find who originally created it, so I'm not going to attribute it to anyone. Just know that somebody probably made it, but it's not the hardest thing in the world because it's just 6 shades of blue and a question mark. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we have a light shade of blue, and then a darker shade of blue, and a darker shade of blue, and then a question mark in the place where a shade of blue would go. And then darker shade of blue, darker shade of blue, darker shade of blue. And here's what's going on. There's a shade of blue missing there. And here's what Hume thinks. Seems like your mind can fill that in. Right? Seems like your mind can realize that like the step from going left to right, from 1 to 2, and then 2 to 3, involved the colors getting darker by a certain amount. But then the jump from 3 to 4, which is to jump right over the question mark, got way darker than the jump from 2 to 3. So it's clear you're missing a shade there. There's a shade intermediate between shade 3 and shade 4. And Hume thinks it might be possible for your mind to just like come up with that. And if that's the case, then you can have a simple impression, or a simple idea rather, with no corresponding impression. Hume raises this point, says like, maybe your mind can do that, which is kind of a big deal for his theory, since in like everything he's going to do from here on out is based on the idea that ideas are copied from impressions. And Hume just seems to think, I don't think this is going to be much of a problem. It seems like this isn't going to happen often. And something worth thinking about, we're not going to really revisit it, is whether or not this is a big problem for Hume or not. I mean, one question you could ask is, do you actually think your mind can provide the missing shade of blue here? The other question to ask, if the answer to that first question is yes, could this pose a problem for Hume? Because this seems like something that contravenes his version of empiricism. Now, it doesn't yet get you to knowledge, right? And as I presented it, rationalism and empiricism are about knowledge. Empiricism would be the view you can't have any knowledge of synthetic truths without appeal to experience. The way that Hume gets to empiricism is by just saying you can't have any perceptions that aren't based on experience. So good luck coming to have knowledge of anything without experience. But if you can have some ideas without appeal to experience, without basing them on experience, then that at least holds out the possibility that you can have knowledge without experience, right? If you can provide the missing shade of blue, what else can your mind do all on its own? Maybe it can do the kinds of things that Plato and Descartes and even Aristotle at some point thought it could do, that kind of intuition that sort of reaches out and gives you direct access to fundamental general truths about the world. But Hume mentions it, says, I don't think this is going to be much of a problem, and moves on. And just keep in mind that this idea is out there. Maybe it'll undermine his argument, maybe it won't. Next up is going to be a video on, or probably a couple videos, on the problem of induction.